What's up guys, Landon here from the Full-Time Filmmaker team, and in this video, I'm going to give you the 5 steps I took to be able to fly cinematic FPV in just 30 days. Now let me preface this video by saying that I still don't consider myself an FPV drone pilot. Just like any skill, it takes a lot longer than just 30 days to really master something like this. There's a lot of trial and error, so don't expect to be a professional after only 4 weeks. Now the goal of this video is to break through the misconception that FPV has a high entry barrier. And even though I spent around $1,500 to get everything you see here, you really don't need to put in that much money to get started. Now, my recommendation is to first invest in an FPV remote controller and an FPV simulator. This way, you'll only need to spend a few $100s, so if for whatever reason you decide FPV is not for you, you're not out a couple $1,000s. And if you do decide that you want to pursue FPV, you'll already have a really important piece of gear that you need to get started, so win-win. And you might be wondering, what even is an FPV simulator? Now, essentially, it's a piece of software, more accurately a game, where you can virtually fly FPV drones. It's a great place to get all of your first 1,000 or so crashes out before doing the real thing. The FPV simulator that we recommend is called LIFTOFF. It costs about 20 bucks and it runs on both PC and Mac. Just make sure your computer has decent specs. Most editing computers will, because this game is pretty GPU intensive. And you technically don't need an FPV controller to play in the LIFTOFF simulator. You could actually use a gaming controller like from your Xbox, but to really get the full effect, I'd recommend picking up an actual FPV controller so you can really get that full FPV experience. Plus, it'll make the transition to flying outside of the simulator much easier. Now, there are a lot of different brands and directions you could go with a remote controller. I decided to go the DJI route because I'm most familiar with that brand, and I would rather use a digital system rather than analog. And I won't go deep on that subject because you could make an entire video just on that topic, but to quickly explain, for years, analog is what professional FPV pilots and hobbyists have used to transmit the image from the drone to their goggles. An analog system has zero latency, meaning that you're seeing exactly what your drone is seeing in real time, although at a much lower quality. But there are limitations to the system, such as interference with other devices, the analog signal not always being able to penetrate through objects, etc. And a digital system, which was more recently introduced and now nearly perfected by DJI, uses a digital signal, with pros being that you have an extremely crisp image while flying. Probably the biggest pro for me personally, because I want to immerse myself in the scene as much as I can. But as you can imagine, with a digital system, there is a touch more lag, stuttering, and freezing once you start losing your signal. If you're racing FPV, then I think this would be more of an issue than if you were just using it for getting cinematic shots like I am, but it's definitely still something to be aware of. Now, the reason I brought up analog and digital is because you'll need to determine which system you want to use so that you can make sure you're buying the right FPV controller. Now, I'd recommend just doing your research and deciding which system checks off the most boxes for you, because it really just comes down to personal preference. I've really enjoyed the DJI digital FPV system, so I've dropped a link below if you want to pick up the same controller that I have. And my second tip is to put in a lot of time on the simulator. I honestly never realized how difficult flying FPV really was until I got into the simulator and started flying. In my first hour or so, I probably crashed a couple hundred times, no joke, and it made me so glad that I started there in the simulator and not outside with an actual drone. I think we tend to underestimate the amount of skill that it actually takes to fly FPV like Mr. Steele or Johnny FPV. That's the beauty of being a professional though, is you make it look easy. But trust me, it is very far from that. The only way that you can reach the skill level of a professional FPV pilot is by putting in the time. The absolute best part about learning on a simulator is that every single aspect that would slow you down in the real world is completely taken away. You don't have to worry about crashing and breaking your drone, the financial strain, the time you need to spend fixing your drone, or learning how to put it back together. Every single hindrance that you might experience is 100% gone. You just need to be willing to dedicate your time. And genuinely, there's no shortcuts, there's no secrets to being a good FPV pilot. It just takes time and dedication. One of my favorite YouTubers is a guy by the name of Mike Boyd. Now, Mike is the guy who takes a random skill like throwing cards, stacking dice, or doing a wheelie, and dedicates his time and energy to mastering that skill. He put out a video a few years back on how to learn things quickly. Again, this is not a shortcut, just some super helpful tips to keep you motivated and focused on your goal. A couple things that really stood out to me in his video was keep your practice sessions short and celebrate your victories. For me, I'll only fly in real life or in the simulator for about 30 minutes at a time. That way my mind's not exhausted and I don't even have enough time to really get frustrated because the sessions are so short. For me, it just keeps me more motivated and it makes me want to fly on a more regular basis. And when I do have an awesome run in real life or on the simulator, I always celebrate it because that excitement and adrenaline rush is again something that keeps me coming back for more. I'd highly recommend checking out Mike's video though. Great tips for learning FPV or anything else. My third tip is to buy a drone that's pre-built. Remember, this video is about how to get started flying FPV as fast as possible. If you're willing to dedicate a lot of time into the technical aspect of FPV, more power power to you. I think that's awesome. At some point, everyone who starts flying FPV is gonna have to dive into that to some degree or another, but I personally chose to go with a pre-built drone for a couple of reasons. Number one is just time. I like to think I'm pretty tech savvy, so I think with some effort, I could better understand how to make, build, and tune an FPV drone, but it wasn't how I wanted to spend my time right off the bat. There's a lot of research that goes into finding the right parts and making sure they're compatible. Then you have to put them all together, do some soldering, then manually program and tune it all. Like I said, it's definitely not impossible, but for me initially, it just wasn't worth the time. And number two is cost. The drone that I use is linked below, and if you actually look closely at the cost of this thing, it's only about $100 more to have it built and tuned so it's ready to fly, as opposed to buying it as a kit that you'd need to put together yourself. Plus, you're paying for a professional to put it together, which means you'll probably have the most accurate build and tuning, more accurate than if you tried doing it yourself for the first time. This means that you can use this professionally built drone as a benchmark, so as you become more familiar with the components and you start needing to replace certain parts, you'll have that standard of excellence basically for a well-built drone. Now, there are a lot of different types of drones and a lot of different sizes, but I've linked below my top 2 picks, one of which is a Cinewhoop designed to get into tight spaces, and the other is a cinematic quadcopter for more high-speed situations. And the fourth tip I have is, once you finally have your drone, transition to the real thing. I'd say you're realistically about half as good in real life as you are in the simulator, at least starting out. And this is due to a few reasons. Number one, when you're flying on the simulator, you're just looking at your computer screen, probably sitting at your desk, but when you actually get into real flying, you'll be wearing FPV goggles, which for me at least takes some getting used to because it's just a different experience. And number two, when you're flying in real life, there's a lot more at stake. You could lose the connection to your drone, you could hit a tree, maybe you wouldn't be able to afford new parts if it broke, etc. Mentally, in the back of your mind, it'll be harder for you to really go all in. My biggest suggestion, no matter how confident you feel on the simulator, is to go fly in a big open field way before you start trying those same maneuvers in real life. Depending on the area that you live, there may already be dedicated areas for flying drones, usually big fields where you're far away from people and other objects. This is definitely the best place to start easing yourself from the simulator into the real world. I have a big goalie right next to my house, and I can go down there pretty much anytime I want and fly completely uninterrupted. There are a few trees here and there and some wooden structures that I can use to practice some tight maneuvers and different tricks, so it's definitely been my favorite spot while I've been learning to fly. And my fifth and final tip is to embrace the FPV culture. Now, most people don't excel in something when they hide and don't engage with people who are interested in the same things. They excel when they surround themselves with like-minded individuals. I think you'd be surprised by how many people fly FPV drones nowadays. One of my buddies who helped with the intro sequence of this video has been flying drones for a few months, and I had no idea until last week, but now I have someone to fly with pretty much anytime I want. If you're in the US, I actually found a website that'll connect you with each state's dedicated FPV racing organization, so you can connect yourself with other FPV pilots. And if you're outside of the US, you could even just hop on Facebook and try and find an FPV group for the area that you're living in. Surrounding yourself with other FPV pilots is a great way to more quickly accelerate your learning and familiarize yourself with the industry. And if you're a little bit antisocial, you can just follow some of your favorite FPV pilots on social media. A few that I've been following for a long time are Johnny FPV, Flex FPV, and Black Sheep FPV. Now, there's obviously a ton more, but there's a few to get you started. I think it's super important to be aware of what other creators are doing and then take different techniques and aspects from their work, whether you're flying with friends side by side or watching someone else's work from across the world. Always be improving and always be learning. All right, guys, that pretty much wraps up this video. If you're interested in that intro sequence that we shot, I'm doing a full virtual job shadow and an editing breakdown of that video, but it's only available in our full course, Full-Time Filmmaker. We put out about 3 or 4 videos each month here on the channel, but inside the course, we put out around 20 videos a month, so tons of content. We're always adding new stuff, updating old videos, and then sharing new techniques and experiences with our 14,000 students. So if you want to be a part of that number, I've dropped a link below so you can join right now. Or if you want to watch our completely free 1-hour filmmaking training, which is basically a free trial of the full course, I've also dropped a link below. We had over 4,000 people tune into it just last week, so you really don't want to miss it. But thanks for watching. If you have any further questions, please let us know.